It's kicked.
All right, great. All right, welcome everyone to the September Layer 7 office hours. Um, this month we'll kind of be doing a little bit of a repeat of content that we had last time around due to some logistical issues with WebEx. Apparently, WebEx decided to change its password on us at the last moment, so for the last go around. So, a number of folks that were trying to get in that weren't able to, and you know, didn't get in until very late. So we decided to go ahead and rerun that content. So Barry Stern is going to take us through that. As always, feel free to ask questions, offer up your advice, your experiences, right? We want this to be as interactive as possible. And we'll leave time at the end too if you have other general questions unrelated to the topic, right? You can ask kind of anything you want. The idea here is you've got access to lots of Layer 7 experts. And so, if you have some topics, questions on your mind, feel free to ask those and we'll address those as best we can on the call. All right, so with that, I will turn it over to Barry, and he's going to talk to us about some migration of gateway policies.
Right. Just start sharing then. How's everybody doing today? Good. All right, is everybody seeing presenter view now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. So we're just going to talk about GMU in a bit. This is pretty much just I'm going to go over some of the main features, not everything, and some tricks and tips and how to manage GMU. Really just a high level, what is GMU? It's basically our standalone migration utility. It's a CLI we provide, Java app that you can use to migrate a gateway from one environment to another, either a full migration or a partial migration to deploy updates and things like that. You can use it to replicate a whole gateway, like take a dev or a build, and you can store it anywhere and use that and import it into a brand new gateway to have an exact clone. You can use it to migrate subcomponents to specific service by folder, policies within your gateway. GMU can also handle migrating dependencies for your services when you do that. And pretty much you can run it anywhere that you can run as long as you have Java installed. So you can run it on a workstation. Some people actually install it on gateways and run it there. Some places have jump boxes. So pretty much it supports pretty much any platform that you can run Java on. So quickly just going to talk about setting up an environment for using GMU. And like Greg said, if anybody's got any questions along the way, just feel free to ask away. So GMU was introduced with the API Gateway with version 8.3. Hopefully nobody has anything older than that they're running. But as long as you're on 8.3 or above, you can use GMU to migrate. And GMU is based on our RESTman service that gets deployed on your target and your source gateways. It talks to the RESTman APIs under the covers. With our newest release of Gateway 10.1, it runs with Java 11, so you have to install Java 11. With 10.1 for the policy manager, everything used Java 11. So on older versions, you could use Java 1.8. I figure most people are on 9.4 or 10 currently, so it would be 1.8 that runs properly. Would download GMU separately from the gateway. It's on our support downloads. Then you just, like I said, you'd install it anywhere, use it. To run GMU, first we have to publish the RESTman service. So it gets published either using the policy manager is an internal service. You publish RESTman. If you're using our bootstrapping or the containers, there's in the documentation how to deploy RESTman when you deploy those as well. One of the things that gets clients sometimes is the max size of a message. When GMU gets deployed, the policy has a max size that's set in the cluster property, RESTman request message max size. So if you're doing a full migration, you have solution kits and other things, a lot of policies, your bundle can exceed that size limit and cause errors. So one of the first things you might need to do is increase that property before migrating. Once you publish RESTman, you can access its internal documentation at this URL on your gateway. There is some information at a high level on using RESTman in tech docs or docops, whatever we call it now. But all the details, like if you want to see all the specifics on the different resources, how to make calls with RESTman, I'm not going to go into all the RESTman calls, all the APIs in this conversation, but it's all published here, and there's templates and samples of the calls. So once you download the migration utility zip from support, you download the whole the developer tools. It's in there. You'll see there's GMU within it. Take GMU to unzip it, extract it where you want it. You have to have your Java home or Java in your path to be able to run GMU. And that's really all it takes to install it. So usually, this is just some practices we've been doing for a while, is once you deploy GMU, to keep things clean, I would usually create a file. You can call it whatever you want, args files, which would contain your different argument files for your different properties, which basically when you run GMU, you can use these argument files to simplify the command line. So it'll contain all the information like your host, users, ports, other properties that you want to pass in when calling GMU and not have to specify every time. You can encrypt your passwords and your passphrases. GMU has an option for encrypt password. So you can basically encrypt your passwords and then store it in your arguments files, so you don't have to store plain text if you want. I also sometimes you'll create an outputs folder, so when you run GMU, all your files will go to that folder or sets of folders depending where you want to do it. And there are a lot of different arguments that you can include in the argument file. These are just some of the most common ones, the host, the user. In this case, you can see the password is the encrypted password. If you wanted to ask like a plain text password, there's a different property for that. Port number, the encryption passphrase, that comes up often. That's used to basically encrypt sensitive data that might be in your bundle, that passphrase. So when a bundle is exported using GMU, like if you have secure passwords, private keys, things like that, they'll be encrypted in the bundle, and you need this passphrase to basically decrypt it and use that bundle in the future. So, any questions on any of that? It's really quiet. I'm audible, right?
Hearing you.
Okay. So when you if you just want to run a quick test, if you just run GMU, the command line, it'll give you an output of the different commands that are supported. It's a good way just to quickly test that, Java's set up right, correct, your Java home, it'll run. If you run any of these options with a help command, like in this example, list help, it'll show you all the different usage, all the different options you can pass in the GMU. Most of the ones on the top are common, and then the ones down farther are all the ones that are specific to that command you're passing in. So first command, list, is a good command to use just to basically test connectivity to a gateway really quick. I'll use just a list. You can pass in, obviously your args file, And in this case, I'm saying, okay, just give me a list of cluster properties. The T is type, and it'll just output. And this way you can ensure that GMU is able to connect to your gateway and authenticate and produce output. It's just a very quick, easy test. It's also good, and the list is good to find the IDs of entities if you want to manage entities by ID. So then we have the browse command, which enables you to find a folder name or the ID in your gateway. And when you export, we can export via name or ID. Sometimes if your names have special characters or spaces or other things, it's easier to do by ID when you export and look up things. So this is a quick way you can look up the IDs of resources. If you pass in the recursive, it's going to give you a lot of output. So just be careful with that one. If you don't pass in recursive, it'll just give you anything at the root level of your gateway, right? If you give it recursive, it's going to drill down in all the subdirectories. So if you've got the OTK, the MAG, other solution kits installed, it can give you a lot of information and scroll for a while.
So Barry, real quick question on this. Will
Sure.
this, because I see it mentions the InfluxDB and OTK, will it migrate the databases as well too for like that sit behind them? Or is
So
it better to use the internal utility for the gateway to migrate the databases?
So it won't migrate the actual database. What it'll migrate is the JDBC connections, right?
Oh, okay.
So any entities in the gateway we can migrate with GMU, but like a database that we're talking to won't get migrated. The data itself, or any other third parties that we're talking to.
Gotcha. Okay.
So migrate out is our basic command that you use to export entities from a gateway. There's a bunch of different ways you can use migrate out. The first one I show, this is an example of doing a full migrate out. So if you pass in the -- all, that's telling GMU, give me everything right in my gateway, and then export that to a bundle. Now, optionally, you can use the include solution kits option. If you use include solution kits, it's also going to export your complete solution kit and including the solution kit registration information. Without the include solution kits, it'll still export your policies and services, but if you migrate that to another gateway, it won't actually install the solution kit and register it with the gateway. There are certain entities that when you do an all don't get exported, some firewall rules and your HTTP default ports and things like that, which get provisioned automatically with a new gateway. But everything else, all your configuration, your cluster properties, all your entities, your services, when you do all, you get pretty much everything. So we can export a specific folder if we wanted to, and with it all the dependencies in that folder. So it'll get me everything that's directly in that folder and any dependencies of that folder. So we can export by folder name in this example. You can also do by folder. If you just say folder instead of folder name, you'd have to pass in the ID that we looked up earlier. And like I said, in this case, I'm saying the default behavior is it will include all the dependencies. So the cluster properties you might be referencing, JDBC connections, stored passwords, all those kind of entities would be exported into that bundle with it. In some cases, you want to export, but you don't want to include your dependencies. There are certain, because you may want to manage them separately. There's other ways. So if you include only service policy, that tells GMU it'll export that folder and everything in that folder directly, but it won't export all the entities that are referenced within the services or policies in that folder. Does that make sense? Everybody, any questions on that?
So what happens with the dependencies then, when you want to migrate in
They
such a folder?
So basically, if when you go to migrate in and you don't include the dependencies, if they don't exist in the target gateway already, you know, the gateway, everything will still be imported. You won't have it. You'll have policy issues. So um,
So
there's
it's a bit
ways.
like mapping with ignore for all external dependencies.
No, they're not even exported. So the references are in the policies, right? But the entities themselves aren't in the bundle. So
Okay.
you either have to manage them separately. A lot of time when you don't include dependencies, it's because you have an existing environment where you may have all the dependencies in there and say, I just made a simple change to a service or a policy, and I just want that one policy, but I don't need everything else because nothing's changed. So instead of having a big bundle with everything in it, you would only have that policy definition and like the folder in this example. So if I did a migrate out and passed in service name instead of folder name, all I'd have in there was that service.
Okay.
So yeah, include only service policy is good when you don't want to bring dependencies for whatever reason. You just want to get what you're specifically targeting. Another common action is default action option, which I'm going to talk about actions more later, but it allows you when you're doing a migrate out to specify what you want the default action on all your entities to be in the bundle. By default, everything is new or existing action, which basically means that when you go to import, the gateway is going to create a new one if it doesn't exist or use the existing if it does. But like I said, I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So
Very one quick question.
sure.
That option include only service policy and its description. By name, it's not really matching. So are we certain that it export the bundle without dependencies? Whether you are trying to export by folder or a policy or service or encas?
So GMU only works right at the level of folder, service, or policy. You have to export by folder, service, or policy. The option, the name is misleading. I know I came across that. So if you're exporting like a policy, it still does the same behavior. Or if you're doing a whole
Okay.
folder, it's the same behavior. The name is a little misleading, but that's the behavior. Is it only exports depending on what you're exporting, those entities. So when you do by folder, obviously it'll give you everything in that folder, but like I said, it won't go and grab all the dependencies of everything in there. So, I know this comes in a lot of times with like our solution kit, like OAuth, where maybe you want to export a policy or service where you have the include OAuth 2.0, authentication, but then in that bundle that grabs a bunch of other related entities, right, for OAuth, for the OTK.
Yeah.
So if you exported that service with the only include service policy, it won't get all that, but then you don't get any dependencies. So
Okay.
um,
Makes sense. Thank you.
mhm. So kind of something that I've been using for a long time is an approach where I basically create a export policy, and you can name it whatever you want. But within a folder, I might just create a policy, and you can call it, export policy. And then in there, I would just reference specific entities that I might want to export. So basically, I'm almost like declaring relationships to this folder. And then so I can reference, cluster properties, JDBC connections, encapsulated assertions, so that then if I want to, I can export that specific policy, and then I would have a bundle with all the dependencies that I might want to export, so I can control that. This is something I've used for doing partial migrations, because GMU doesn't support the ability to easily say, you can do it through RESTman, but GMU itself doesn't support the ability to say, I want to export an encapsulated assertion, right, as a type. So by using an export policy like this, you can export other entities with GMU without using RESTman.
So just a quick question about that, Barry.
Sure.
So if you're referencing an encapsulated assertion, for example, but you use the export only service policy, then you won't get the dependency for the encapsulated assertion. Is that right?
That's correct. So that's why in this example, I've put in here, a folder one encapsulated assertion. So if I was to run this migrate out with the only export service, I wouldn't get that encapsulated assertion. I'd still have my policy that is referenced, but I wouldn't get the actual encapsulated assertion. So by embedding the encapsulated assertion itself in this policy, then exporting this policy with dependencies, I'll get the policy and the encapsulated assertion.
Yeah. Okay. So what if I want the reference to the encapsulated assertion, also the encapsulated assertion itself, but I don't want all kind of other dependencies like JDBC connections or whatever. What would be the approach then?
Of the policy?
Yes, I want to, yeah, I have this folder and with several services and policies and all kind of dependencies in that. And I also created encapsulated assertion and fragment is in this folder. So if I want to export it, I also want this encapsulated assertion export.
Yeah, if you don't want
But
the
I don't want all the other dependencies that are in there, like keys and GDBC connections or whatever.
yeah,
What's
if
the best
you
approach for that?
the best approach for that would be using the RESTman option, either through GMU or directly, because you can export an encapsulated assertion itself, and through RESTman, right?
Yeah.
If you're doing it this way, if I was to export this with dependencies with the encapsulated assertion, it's going to give me the policy that encapsulated assertion references and any dependencies in that policy as well.
Okay.
Okay. So migrate in. Test is always fun. So test is our friend. So we can, after you've exported a bundle, you want to migrate it in, you can run the migration in command and pass a test option. What this will do is it'll simulate what it would have done if it migrated it, and it'll output it to what we specify, in this case, results.xml. So then you can go look at the results XML and see what actions GMU would have taken. And when you run the command, it tells you whether or not the migration would have been successful or not. And if it's not successful, then you can go into the results and see why, what the issue is, what you need to fix. What happens a lot of times is you have discrepancies between entities when they're manually created between environments. So we have a way to reconcile that, which I'll go into in a minute. But this is a good way just to see if your import would have been successful. So you can see here it's a very simple bundle. I had a test bundle, and it's telling me, okay, I've got a folder and a service, and you can see the action that was requested was new or existing, which means if the entity doesn't exist, create it. But if it does exist, use the existing. So it won't update it. It'll, if there's a change. And the action taken in this case by this test was it says it used existing. So it means, oh, this service, this policy, I found these already existed in my target environment. So I'm not going to do an update. So in effect, GMU isn't doing anything here. This gets a lot of people when they first start working with GMU because they do a migrate out and they do a migrate in, but nothing changed. By default, most of the entities, the action is new or existing. So when you run that migrate in, nothing is going to change. Nothing's going to get updated. Anybody, I'm sure, anybody who's used GMU has run into this when they first start. So what we have is the ability, a manage mappings command, which allows us to modify the actions of our entities within our bundle before we import them. So we've run a test, for example, and we saw, oh, well, my folder and service didn't update, but I want to update them, because I made changes. They already exist. So what we can do is after we migrate our data out, if we have actions we want to change or we have conflicts with actions due to mismatching IDs, which happens a lot of times where you have an entity with the exact same name but a different ID under the covers, it produces a conflict with GMU, which we have to resolve. So using our managed mappings, we can say we want to change the default action to new or existing to a newer update, for example. There's a bunch of different actions, but newer update basically means if when I go to import, if the entity doesn't exist, I'm going to create a new one. But if it does exist, I'm going to update the existing with the one in the bundle. So that's how we basically migrate changes after something has been already created. So when we do, we run a manage mappings command on our bundle, which we say, okay, I want to change my action to newer update. And in this case, I'm showing an example where I'm saying, in my bundle, find all services, types of service or folder, and change their action to newer update. So what that does is it modifies in the bundle and says, when I go to import, I'm going to use the newer update action for my service and folders. And you can also do this specifically by for a folder by name or by ID or all. Like sometimes maybe cluster properties is another one where sometimes maybe you don't want to modify cluster properties at all. So you could change the action to ignore even, which says don't even import my cluster properties if they're in the bundle because maybe they all exist already. And that comes up a lot of times where you have existing environments and doing partial migrations. And your cluster properties are intentionally different between environments. Same thing, we use manage mappings to resolve conflicts as well as just changing our actions. So in this case, you can see we ran a test and it said the migrate in failed because of a conflict. So when we go look at the results, we can see there was a conflict because I'm trying to import a folder where the folder name already exists, but with a different ID. So this is a very common situation where you've created a folder, test in your source, then you manually created the same folder in your destination, and the IDs aren't the same in the two environments. So even though the names are the same, the IDs are different. So GMU by default maps everything by ID. So it says, I didn't find the ID, so I'm going to create a new one. But then when it goes to create it, there's a name conflict, so GMU errors. So what we have to do is then tell GMU to map instead of by the ID to map by name. So map by name is our friend. So if you're in a situation where you've been manually creating things along the way, you're going to run into this entity conflict issue. So what you can do is you can tell GMU that instead of mapping by ID, you can map by name. So in this case, I'm saying, take this folder named folder 1, and in my bundle, map that by the name, the target name folder 1. So instead of GMU saying, I'm looking for a folder with the ID of, this GUID, I'm looking for a folder by the name of folder 1, and I'm going to do either a newer update or newer existing, whatever the action is, but by the name instead. Any questions on that before I move on?
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Sure.
This command is specifically targeting a one particular entity, right? So can we do something similar in a large way, like some set of entities, variety of entities by different types? Is it really possible? Or should I always focus on one entity at a time?
Yeah, usually it's a specific entity, right? So because you're using this to address specific conflicts where something's been manually created in
Okay.
in multiple
Mhm.
environments. So you specify the source and the target. Um, a lot of the times, if you use GMU from the start and like we showed earlier, do like an all and migrate everything from dev to test to prod, your entity IDs and will stay the same and you won't have this issue. So depending
Right.
what you have, I've actually even recently a lot of clients, a lot of people, what they're doing is when they're going to like Gateway 10, um, they're taking like production exports and backing that up into a new dev and using that to build out and bring everything forward as a whole new environment, so that when you have everything, you from now on you can automate everything and you won't have conflicts in that way because your IDs are the same between
Yeah.
environments.
Right.
Um,
Got it.
Can I add something to that? If you do have some kind of specific object which is named the same in your source as in your target, like this example for folders, but if it's in general, like for connections, like a GDBC connection, and you have several GDBC connections, but they're named in the source the same as in the target. You can do it. If you don't add the minus target name, just leave it out. You can do it. You can map on source name. You can do it for the complete type, but then it's for all objects with this specific type.
Right, but by type you can. So you so with managed mappings you can use any entity type, JDBC connection, cluster property. It can be anything that you can map by type or by name or by so. Any questions on this or comments before we move on? Okay. So now that we've managed our mappings, done our test, we can actually migrate in a bundle. So we basically, it's the same command we used with the test. We just removed the test option. Perform migrate in, pass in our args file, pass in our specify, our bundle file, and give an output file. And hopefully we get a migrate in successful. Then if you want, you can look at the results file and you can see what actions were taken. In this case, I've told it that I wanted to update. I wanted to do a newer update instead of newer existing. So the action taken was it updated the existing entities with the ones from the bundle file. We also have a template command which allows us to override and control environment-specific values between our different environments. So we talked a little bit about things like JDBC connections, cluster properties. So when you're migrating in between environments, there are environment-specific information that you might need to change in your bundle before you migrate it in after you migrate it out. So we have a template command which basically allows it'll take our bundle and it'll parameterize the whole bundle and create a properties file in this, key value pair notation like you see. So then you can go in, example for this JDBC connection, I need to change my URL, the host name. It's a different database host I need to talk to, right? Or I might need to change the password or the username or something else. So you can change the values in this properties file before you do a migrate in. And then optionally, we can detemplate the bundle after we make our changes, which basically it will take all the parameters that you've updated and merge them back into your bundle file. You don't have to do that though. Most of the times you run the migrate in specifying the template file as well. So if you do a detemplate, and you merge your changes back into a bundle file, then you do a migrate in just like you would any other time, and it's going to migrate in and do your updates and change the values as they were. If you don't detemplate before you migrate in, then basically when you perform your migrate in, you just specify the template option and give the path to your template properties file. So GMU will read the template and use the values accordingly. Any questions on that? This is one approach to managing those environment-specific values between environments. Sometimes it's if you know what those values are, you may just write a script and use RESTman directly to say, update these, or there are other ways as well. And then these are some of the links to the documentation. GMU, basic getting started, running GMU. It talks about setting up GMU and the basic commands. And there's additional help for every command. I didn't hit every command. There's a couple I didn't talk about for GMU, but there's additional help with all the different options as well in the documentation. And then managing conflicts. I showed, one or two of the approaches, mapping by name, updating actions. There's a bunch of others that you can do as well. There are samples of them in the documentation, tech docs. And that's the end of my presentation. So if any questions or comments?
Hey, this is Al. I did have a couple of questions.
Okay.
So you cover GMU. I was wondering if you had any guidance on when to use GMU versus if you have a portal, using the portal APIs for the purpose of migrations.
If you're using portal managed everything, then you'd use portal, but sometimes you have portal managed versus gateway managed where you may be having both. So with the portal, you can easily migrate entities between different environments because your portal can be connected to multiple environments. So you can just move it. And I don't know who, if somebody else is on from Broadcom who wants to talk a little about portal, but from the gateway side, anything that's not portal managed, you use GMU for.
Okay. All right. So that's really the distinction. If it is truly sourced in gateway, then GMU is probably your best bet. But if you're running through portal and you need to move those across environments, then the portal APIs is the choice.
If you're defining proxies in the portal and publishing those, you would still do that via the portal during the process you have, because the developers would go in, they define their proxies, they push it to a test gateway. When you're ready, you'd want to promote that and deploy it to another gateway, a production gateway, and you don't need GMU to do that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
I think for me, there's a split there between if it's APIs that you're publishing through Portal, then that's a good way to go. If it's like policy templates or policies that those APIs might reference once they're deployed to gateways, then GMU is probably a good bet. There's some new functionality in Portal where you can do deployment of gateway bundles via Portal as well. But GMU still gives you that that gateway level utility for doing the bundle migration at that level too.
Gotcha.
Thank you. That made sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. Thanks. I did have an additional question, not directly related to GMU, but I guess more process oriented. So do you have any recommendations on like, a source control pattern that you've seen used successfully? And how to manage the different objects that could go through migration.
We do have some customers I'm aware of that do integrate with source control and source management, where they'll check out bundles and check them into Git and manage them. So like you saw when we run the command, you can basically give a bundle any name you want. You can put, you know, a date on it. So if you automate this and you have scripts to run, you know, you may automatically, you know, version control, date the bundles. So like it's a fairly, from a GMU perspective, it's fairly straightforward because you'd run GMU, you'd then check the bundle in, and then, you know, you'd have on the other side it where you'd check the bundle out and you'd have to run GMU to import it. So
Gotcha. And when you say bundle, you're saying a bundle for a collection of things, not necessarily the entire set of gateway policies and all of that, right?
yeah,
Okay.
and I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but we also have GMU by default behavior. It creates one big bundle file. There's also an option that you can create separate files. So instead of having one big bundle XML blob, you can have separate files be created, which this is documented well. So depending you know, at what level you want to manage things, you can use the separate files, or you can run GMU specifically like at a folder level. Is a pretty popular option. A lot of clients, they may have different groups and different projects, and they manage things at a folder level. So they'll create everything they care about at a folder. They'll check that folder out, manage that as, you know, a service entity or whatever, you know, and then they can promote just that from environment to environment or version control that. So that's probably the most common approach I've seen is the folder level.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's the approach that we use as well. Okay.
One quick question, Barry.
How does this relate to the gateway policy plugin? Because that seems to be much more oriented towards CI/CD and source control.
Does anybody want to talk about the policy plugin? Or yeah, the policy plugin and GMU are different utilities. The policy plugin was being developed to more work at that container level where an export entities at a different level. GMU has been around for a while and a lot of clients are using it.
I'll chime in, Barry. So yes, we did started with containers in mind when we started with policy plugin, but the ultimate goal was to move over artifacts, move over bundles, right? So when we released the new version, it ideally works for appliances and containers as well. Again, it's still early release. GMU is definitely a mature product. We're slowly working on enhancing policy plugins. Again, you're more than welcome to use policy plugin or GMU, whichever suits your purpose, and provide us feedback, and we will improve as we go along. From a future perspective, we think something which can help customer make their life easy, like something within a like something which is compatible to CI/CD, is going to be most helpful for our customers in the future. Again, different customers have different requirements. Some use their own script on top of GMU. Some customers like a Broadcom provided solution. So again, we're working on a discovery at this moment and try to find out the problems that needs to be solved, and a solution can be expected in a medium to long term.
What's the best way to give you feedback? Through the support tickets?
Either support tickets or forums like office hours or community blogs, any way possible. If required, we can. I believe you have our email IDs. I'm not sure. Maybe we can share our email IDs later on. You can send us a fire us email as well.
Can this be a subject for a next office hours, maybe?
Pardon me, Remco?
Can this be a subject for one of the next office hours, maybe, to show some demos or best practices using the policy plugin?
We're working on that. Actually, we started with we were supposed to do policy plugin session, but we thought let's do GMU session first and then work on policy plugin a little later.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm making a note of that for future office hours. Thank you.
Questions related or unrelated to GMU?
One question from my side. Using GME, I would like to hear more about how the customer would deal with the dependencies out of multiple GMU exported projects.
So do you mean that you're exporting the same dependency multiple times, or I'm not sure I'm following the question.
For example, let's consider a scenario where I exported multiple folders, but from one folder content is depending on another. So how do we educate the customers, or how does we control the dependencies while building the bundles or while migrating the contents from file system to the gateway? So which one would go to the migrating, which one is not? So where do we actually capture all this information? Is it something it is by practice or any tools we develop on top of GMU?
So
I was just going to say, one of the things that we've done is to try to find patterns so that we don't have a lot of variations where we have dependencies that have to be managed. So for example, a lot of our policies are pretty straightforward, where we have the service, the policy, and a collection of cluster-wide properties. So what we would do is try to keep with that pattern for a lot of our policy definitions as much as possible, and set up the necessary include fragments so that we can precede those in different environments so that those dependencies are already there. And then as we're exporting, just kind of by default, instead of having new or existing be the default, we default everything to ignore, and then selectively turn on things that we think we need to manage dependencies for using the manage mappings functionality or manage actions functionality.
Okay.
yeah, I've used that approach too. When just you can, when you're exporting, you can basically set the default action to ignore, and then just specifically enable like cluster properties or what you want to be referenced. And usually, if you have like a common component that's used across different services, different folders, a lot of times we'll create, a kind of folder just for those, and manage those separately as well. So if you've got kind of like these functions you write that you use over and over by different services, instead of managing those within the folder, you might manage those in a separate folder. And depending exactly what you're looking to do, you can use the export policy approach to include those or specifically export those as a bundle at some point. There's a few different ways you can handle it. It's pretty flexible.
Yeah. And one last question. So if the changes are so frequent, so how the customers are dealing with reviews?
Like change management?
Yeah.
That's, every organization is different about their policy. We have I've worked with some clients who they have very strict policies where they can't touch anything in production manually. Everything has to be scripted and automated, right? So they rely heavily on all, GMU and RESTman, and they won't even use the policy manager in production at all. And then, there are some clients who still do everything manually, and then there's people in the middle. Everybody. So it's really an organizational decision about, you know, what requires change and how to manage that.
Yeah, one approach that we're using is to treat all the policy definition as kind of infrastructure or as policy as code, and wrap like a GitOps flow around it so that changes are made in a dev or test environment or a dev environment. They're extracted, put under source control. Somebody raises a pull request for review, and we spin off a feature or test branch to house those changes until they're reviewed and merged into the main branch, and let automation take it from there.
Okay, thank you.
I did have a kind of a related question. So in terms of post-deployment testing, are there any has anything been used to set the stage so that things could be validated once things have been deployed, specifically from a policy perspective? Like, has anybody gone? Have you seen anyone kind of go the distance to create hooks in their policy for the purpose of testing? Or, I mean, you'd have to know a lot about the behavior of the underlying API to be able to test adequately. But just from a sanity check in terms of the policy being moved and having everything migrated,
I mean,
is there any post check that you've seen common?
Not really.
No, okay.
As far as that goes, I mean, the most something we've been trying to promote for a lot of time is API testing lifecycle, right? So
Sure.
With different tools, BlazeMeter can do it, and other tools can too, where when you can actually test the APIs and do performance testing and other kind of testing as you promote them and automate those tests. So as you move things through the life cycle, but there's nothing really like think of within policy, and obviously not every environment is, but in high transaction volume environments, you're concerned with performance and other things, so you want to keep your policies and services as streamlined as possible, and make sure you're deploying in a way that you're not going to affect performance.
Okay.
And I know it was just brought up, but if you haven't read it, there's our thinking in policy documentation out on Tech Docs or on the website. It goes over a little bit of this, how to write policy in a way that supports, CI/CD flow and automation, with not really hard coding, information that could be changed between environments in your policies. And I didn't talk about that as part of GMU really, but in general, policies and practices that can help in facilitating that kind of automation. So you can treat your policy logic and your services as code, check them in, and not have to modify the actual source between environments.
Just to add one thing on the testing side of things, an idea that we've been looking at, internally anyway, is the concept of including. So I know a lot of our customers use Postman as quite a popular tool. So there's an open source tool called Taurus, or an open source software called Taurus, and Taurus allows you to run tests against containers or against OVAs, and Taurus itself can be in a container too. So you can actually have a Postman collection included in your source repository, and you can use that as a test bench with Taurus running as part of a CI/CD pipeline. So that's something that I wanted to provide some documentation on in the next over the next couple of months. Is that something that would be of interest? So to have a Postman collection So it wouldn't necessarily include all of the additional side of the CI/CD pipeline, because that's going to be very specific to the way that your CI/CD flow works. But just to include that testing and have a way to actually run something.
That would be very interesting.
Yeah, that would be useful.
Great. Well, yeah. I'll look to get something to get some documentation on that then.
Cool.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I think we're kind of at the end of the time here. Definitely appreciate everyone's joining. Some really great conversation here. So definitely appreciate all the interaction. And yeah, look out for our next series of October office hours. That'll be posted back to the community site as usual. And in the meantime, just yeah, feel free to reach out via the community or support if there are any other questions. And hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all for hosting this. This was fantastic. You all have a great day too.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.